for joining us for this evening's live streaming of the guest recital of Dr. Andy Lagrimas. The beginning of this evening will start with a brief lecture regarding Claude Debussy, and then we'll conclude after a brief intermission with a short concert of some of Debussy's works.
To welcome Dr. Andy Lagrimas, who is from Abraham Baldwin College in Tifton, Georgia, and he's going to be providing us with a lecture and then performance of Claude Debussy's Preludes, Book 1. So it should be a really good performance tonight. And there will be a short pause in between the lecture, which will be about 20 minutes long. The lecture will be, and then he'll proceed to play the Preludes. Thank you, and this will be a good time to silence your cell phones.
Thank you all for being here tonight. So the composer at the center of tonight's lecture has been called a lot of things: a poet, a revolutionary, a visionary, and an innovator. Indeed, Claude Debussy has been called a lot of things, but historically the label we associate most often with him, the one that we all learn in describing his music, is impressionist. Green lights. I was told to hold it in, and then it turns green. Is this the power button? Okay. Well, I will continue holding this in until something happens, but I will go on from there. The impressionist label that we often apply to Debussy's music, is both a befitting and misleading one. On one hand, when listening to Debussy's music, Debussy and Impressionism does seem like a natural fit. It is easy to hear a work like Clair de Lune or The Reverie and immediately be transported to the impressionistic worlds of a Monet or a Renoir. That is, to be honest, a huge part of the music's appeal. As New York Times music critic Tom Tomasini wrote in 2012 on the 150th anniversary of Debussy's birth, quote, "We like to think we know and admire Debussy. Debussy, the great impressionist. For painting, there is Monet. For music, Debussy." Tomasini's words sum up how many of us feel when we hear a work like Clair de Lune. However, Tomasini goes on to state that with Debussy's music, there is more than meets the eye, or in this case, the ear. He claims, quote, "Yet the alluring surfaces of Debussy's works can sometimes mask the utter daring of the music, just as the surface beauties of impressionistic paintings can hide the shocking experiments that these works represent." So it's important to remember that for all the beauty in much of Debussy's music, Debussy's place in music history is that of an innovator, one whose music would influence countless other figures such as Stravinsky, Arnold Schoenberg, and Ligeti, not to mention other genres such as jazz, new wave, and film scores. So why do we use the Impressionist label in the first place, especially since most of Debussy's major piano works, especially including the one you're going to hear tonight, came well after the Impressionist movement? Well, for this we have the music critics to thank. An 1887 review on one of Debussy's early student works was the first to use the label. Quote, "Debussy clearly has a strong feeling for color in music, which, when exaggerated, causes him to forget the importance of clarity of design and form. It is very much to be hoped that Debussy will be on his guard against that vague impressionism, which is one of the most dangerous enemies of truth in any work of art. In other words, Debussy's music, while full of tone, color, and sounding beautiful, lacked the traditional structure and form that a work such as a Beethoven or a Mozart composition might have contained, which made it a little bit inferior. One can also see the connection to the visual art movement of the same name, in which color and light and shading take precedence over form and shape. And as you can see here, the Impressionist label persists to this very day, not just in music scholarship, but also in the broader public perception. Debussy scholar Matthew Brown describes one of Debussy's places in music culture today. Quote, "Debussy's music has had a major impact on a significant genre of popular music, easy listening. Since easy listening puts a premium on melodic writing, its exponents were attracted to Debussy's salon works, such as the Arabesque, the Reverie, and Clair de Lune. Record companies lined their pockets with revenue from compilations with insipid titles like Debussy and the Ocean, Debussy at Dawn, Debussy for Relaxing. Domestic diva Martha Stewart includes several works by Debussy on a CD of French Impressionistic dinner classics that also boasts recipes for rack of lamb. And on YouTube, Debussy's presence can be summed up as follows. See the timer in the lower left? 3 hours of this, all for putting your baby to sleep. So I argue that the Impressionist label, while in some cases appropriate, does tend to oversimplify and limit the perception of what Debussy accomplished as a composer. As I hope to show you all tonight, Debussy's music goes far beyond the single label. Like the music of the greatest composers, Debussy's output shows a clear musical evolution from the relatively formulaic early works to a mature style which is unmistakably his own. Indeed, if one were to look objectively at Debussy's vast musical output, only a portion of his works truly qualify as impressionist. As for Debussy's feelings about the label, it could be summed up in one of his letters. He noted that critical reception to his music described his efforts as, quote, "They say I am trying to do something different, what the imbeciles call impressionism," unquote. So the work at the center of tonight's recital, book one of the preludes, I'll just talk, is widely considered to be one of Debussy's most influential works for piano and a true landmark of 20th century piano literature. Dating from 1910, the preludes are a product of Debussy's mature curative composition and indeed came several decades after the so-called Impressionist period. Now, while one can look to the preludes as an innovative and forward-looking work for the piano, it's important to note that Debussy's 2 books of 24 preludes are actually an homage to the past. The practice of grouping together smaller piano pieces into a larger set has provided inspiration for composers for several decades, way before Debussy. Many pianists will be familiar with these works. In particular, Johann Sebastian Bach's 48 pairings of preludes with fugues in the Well-Tempered Clavier, and Chopin's 24 preludes are the clear precursors for Debussy. While Bach and Chopin organized their collections of preludes harmonically, Debussy instead broke tradition by giving each prelude a prochromatic or descriptive title, and organizing his 24 preludes into a kind of gallery of images. Now, while the descriptive titles might lead a casual listener to associate the preludes as a kind of painting with music, and hence the convenience of the Impressionist label, the placement of the titles at the end of the piece, as you can see in the lower right there, this is an actual score of the preludes, and as you can see, the title follows the final measure instead of the customary place at the top of the page. This has inspired a lot of commentary on the rather anti-impressionistic nature of this gesture. Perhaps the placement of titles after the music is meant to suggest that these images described by the music are in fact secondary to the musical experience itself, to the sound. This would actually place Debussy more in the symbolist rather than the Impressionist movement, which valued the sensual experience of an art form rather than what it actually represented. In approaching Debussy's music, we would do well to note a litany of inspirations and resources that I argue are even stronger than Impressionistic art. This interdisciplinary approach to Debussy's music is the focus of my lecture. So in order to grasp the importance of the interdisciplinary art forms to Debussy's music, it's important to understand that Debussy's life as a composer living in Paris was indeed a kind of interdisciplinary art form pursuit. Unlike other great composers such as Haydn, Beethoven, and Chopin, who often wrote their music in complete isolation, shut out from the world, Debussy saw the outside world not as something to avoid, but something to inspire his music. Paris of the late 19th century was a place of artistic flowering and cultural thriving, with a populace of artists, dancers, performers, actors, musicians, and authors, all converging together on a bohemian scene. Debussy scholar Roy Howitt noted that in the early 1880s, Debussy served as an accompanist for singers at the newly opened cabaret Le Chat Noir, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with the poster. This was a gathering place for different literary personalities. Debussy's acquaintances from his work at the cabaret led to his acceptance into numerous literary and artistic circles throughout Paris. Many of these did have a direct influence on his music, including, as you'll see, tonight's collection of preludes. Another major influence was the 1889 Universal Exposition, or World's Fair, held in Paris. This opened Debussy up to new worlds of Eastern influence harmonies and musical styles such as the Javanese gamelan. Gradually, these influences also found their way into Debussy's compositional style. The first art form that I want to discuss tonight in music is dance. Now, it's important to note that Debussy was clearly not a dancer himself, and that his piano music in the preludes was not meant to be danced to, like you might expect a waltz or a minuet. But rather, they're not exact replicas of dance rhythms by any means. Rather, Debussy's interpretation of dance is more suggestive, much like an impressionistic painting. It's an allusion to a style rather than a rhythmic quotation of it. So first, the opening prelude, Danseuses de Delphes, or Delphic dancers. This was a depiction of a Greek ritual, possibly inspired by a display at the Louvre. The pianist Alfred Cortot describes it as follows, quote, "They turn and pass, grave and silent, to the slow rhythm of harps, timbrels, and flutes. And in the mysterious shadow of the temple, heavy with the fragrant rising spirals of holy incense, there reposes invisible but present the unknown dance frozen in time. The second prelude, Voiles, is interesting because the title has a dual translation. Many words in any foreign language really often do not have an exact or a single translation to English, and voile is one of them. Pianist Alfred Cortot translated the title as to mean the sails of boats that flutter gently in the breeze. However, Debussy scholar Paul Roberts points to another possible translation, which are the veils that are used by French dancer Voiles, who was quite prominent in France during this time, and Debussy would have no doubt been aware of her. This was an American dancer who was well known for her celebrated serpent dance at the Follies. This was choreographed with colored lights, which even that was a bit of a novelty during this time, and these colored lights would reflect on the translucent veils that she swirled around her body. This, of course, is all represented in the use of whole tones and a passage which evokes the motion of swirling. And for those of you familiar with music theory, voile is dominated by the use of whole tone scales, which gives it a quote-unquote modern sound. We can take a look at some of this of Voiles' dance. This is the silent film, by the way, so finally, we have the fifth prelude in the series, La Colline d'Anacapri, a depiction of the island of Capri located just south of Naples, off the Italian and Sicilian coastlines. Here, the main inspiration is the Italian folk dance known as the tarantella, which Debussy emulates by utilizing a dotted dance rhythm. Let's actually listen and watch the music first. I'm sure most of you will recognize this music immediately as being stereotypically Italian.
La tarantella napoletana, la tarantella napoletana, sono music, stop.
second major influence in terms of interdisciplinary arts on Debussy's music was that of literature. Debussy was extraordinarily well-read as a composer, and this literary knowledge shows up in many of the preludes that you're going to hear tonight. One main inspiration for Debussy's music was his brief stint as editor of the literary magazine La Revue Blanche from 1901 to 1902. Although formally known as an art and literary magazine, this publication served as the radical voice of the avant-garde establishment, with figures such as Mallarmé, Verlaine, and Baudelaire, using the magazine as a platform to voice their opinions and call for social reform. During Debussy's brief time as the editor there, he published 8 essays, the most famous of these being 2 that he published as a conversation between himself and his alter ego figure named Monsieur Croche. In these essays, Debussy found the freedom, through his alter ego, to express his own avant-garde leanings and challenge what he saw as the conventional techniques of tonal composition. As with his experiences at La Chat Noir, the exposure Debussy received to other art forms and to ways of thinking during his time as editor would be highly influential in his music. And the first of the preludes I wish to look at is one of the more famous ones entitled La fille aux cheveux de laine, or the girl with the flaxen hair. The main theme of this, many people have pointed to as representative of the idea of the feminine image of long hair. Throughout social convention and throughout all kinds of art, long hair has come to symbolize all things feminine. And this idea certainly comes into play with this prelude. However, I also want to call attention to the structure of the poem. Now, I studied my Rosetta Stone for weeks, but couldn't get to the point where I can read you this today. But you can look at this, and even non-native French speakers can see clearly the use of a chorus or a refrain in this poem, highlighted in yellow, which leads me to believe that the original poem from which this prelude is based might have been meant to be an accompaniment for a song initially. And that informs the performance, because then you would look to play it like an accompanist and not so much as a soloist. The 11th prelude of the series, La Danse des Puck, is taken from, as some of you might know, the Puck character from Shakespeare's play A Midsummer Night's Dream. Several of Debussy's piano works make reference to fairies, nymphs, and ghosts, the kind that populate familiar children's stories. Now, of course, Puck is from a little bit more of a grown-up world from Shakespeare. But the image that Puck represents is familiar to most with the image of the mischievous character, the mischievous elf, or the mischievous gnome. The things that they don't mean harm, but their character is there to cause mischief and to cause some kind of conflict, which must be resolved in the end. Here, Debussy alludes to the character of Puck with a dotted rhythm, which is meant to, I guess, emulate the type of movement that Puck would do. For those who have read A Midsummer Night's Dream, another character is the character of King Oberon, and Debussy draws contrast between the two in the more authoritative figure of King Oberon. Do we have any horn or bugle players out in the audience? No, that's fine. Well, for those of you who have played or know, oftentimes bugles and horns are used for what? Traditionally. What do we often hear bugles and trumpets play? Any ideas? As an attention getter. Yeah, a herald or a fanfare. And that's what you hear in this music. You have this figure, Puck's figure, which immediately gets interrupted by King Oberon's horn, know, trumpet and bugle playing, oftentimes, especially the bugles that don't have the balance, they can only play using the partials of the octave and the fifth, and that's exactly what you hear in the music. And the final literature-inspired prelude I wish to point to is the one in the center of the collection, and for many the deepest one emotionally, because it is the most technically difficult prelude, and also in terms of virtuosity and emotion, the darkest or even violent. This is French translation is What the West Wind Saw. And here, Debussy, it's a much more violent prelude than what we're used to. The music does not sound very much like Debussy at all. In fact, the opening measures have a kind of menace to them. The inspiration here is the character of Zephyrus, which, if you know the word zephyr to mean a kind of wind, Zephyrus was the Greek god of the west wind, and a character in Hans Christian Andersen's story, The Garden of Paradise. Traditionally, even outside of Hans Christian Andersen, the four winds, north, south, east, and west, are often assigned a kind of personification, and many times the west wind sometimes is playful, but other times it can be a destructive and violent wind, and that's what you'll hear tonight. And finally, I wish to leave you with one prelude that you could really call impressionist, and you could really say is inspired in terms of interdisciplinary influences by art, visual art. And this is one of the, again, more famous ones, La Cathedrale, engloutie, which translates into the sunken cathedral. Here, Debussy is alluding to an ancient Breton myth where a cathedral has been submerged underneath a lake to punish its citizens for their inequities. And every few centuries, it's allowed to magically rise up out of the water and then sink back down again. And it's a very programmatic, meaning storytelling type prelude that you'll hear. But beyond that, beyond the myth, I argue that Debussy clearly was influenced by the Monet series, where, I don't know if you've seen this series, it's like 24 or so different paintings, all of the same cathedral, depicting it at different times of day. And I want to call your attention to Debussy's markings. Those of you who are musicians are used to seeing things like allegro, moderato. Debussy's marking for this music says, dans un brume doucement sonore, which translates to through a softly resonant mist. And that word mist is important because when we think of impressionist paintings, we often think of the haziness or the indirect suggestion of an object or of a cathedral in this case. And the fact that Debussy uses a very specific word like mist to describe his music clearly means he's after the same kind of technique that impressionist painters would have wanted. So if you listen to the beginning of this, you'll hear a lot of mist through the use of the pedal. This prelude, you will hear I promise, you will hear the point where the cathedral emerges fully from the water. So, whether or not you still consider a work like the Preludes impressionist or not, there is no denying the place that these piano works hold within Debussy's output. Unlike some of Debussy's earlier piano works, which were slow to gain favor with critics and audiences, the the preludes were immediately hailed as masterpieces. According to Debussy biographer Roger Nichols, only 3 weeks after their initial publication, the preludes were being hailed as, quote, wonderful masterpieces by no less an authority than Maurice Ravel. Paul Roberts noted that by the end of the 1920s, less than a decade after their composition, complete performances of the preludes were the norm in the concert hall, a testimony to the strength, logic, and stylistic consistency of each book. And if you think about classical music, which can take decades, centuries for a work to gain a place in the repertoire, right? Think about what new music, how quickly, new music can come and go. That's quite an accomplishment for a new work. Indeed, the preludes are often hailed as Debussy's most mature and complete masterpiece in the way they reveal an entire world of art, nature, culture, geography, literature, and more within their relatively brief length. And I conclude my lecture with a quote that I believe sums up the essence of the preludes from Debussy himself. Music begins where words are powerless to express. Music is made for the inexpressible. For those of you who only know Debussy through Clair de Lune, I hope the performance tonight takes you beyond Impressionism and into a whole new level of appreciation for Debussy and for his music. We'll stop there and take a break. Thank you guys for being such a wonderful audience.
Thank you. That will conclude this evening's live stream of the guest recital of Dr. Andy Lagrimas. We hope you'll join us for next Monday's band concert on Monday, May 27th at 7:30 p.m.